Welcome back to UF 100, the history of identity. And before we get started with particulars here, hopefully things are going well with your transition and you're finding ways to adapt to, well, our new abnormal. So hopefully this is all going to be over sooner as opposed to later. But just in case if you weren't aware, for the rest of the semester, everything is going to be delivered online here at Boise State. So we'll continue doing versions of narrated PowerPoints such as this. And then for discussion group, we're going to be making use of the Zoom technology. All right, so what we have to do here in the short term is make some changes for the course. So what I've tried to do, and you can follow this link on Blackboard if you go to our syllabus, I've revised all of the grading. Some things were closed, so as you can see here on the screen, there towards the bottom left column, the UF Fellows program is no longer viable because we can't be together in person. So that's been closed, and everyone got 50 points credit for doing that. So in the left column, you see everything that's already been completed. So on the second column, you have the 4 remaining elements that we have yet to complete. So we're going to try to focus on those 4 elements as we go forward. And our intent with this is to streamline everything with grading. So to keep it straightforward, here in UF 100, there'll be 4 things we'll be asking you to finish between now and the first part of May. So those 4, we can see here how it's kind of drawn out, what kind of projects, the delivery format we're anticipating, and the due dates. So again, you've got this on our Blackboard homepage, but we've got 45% of the remaining grade that's up for grabs. So we still, for those folks who are doing their math, there's still a pretty big chunk of the course that's left in front of us. All right, so these are going to be the 4 elements. But today, for this narrated PowerPoint, what we're going to focus on is that third column under team. What this narrated PowerPoint is about is setting up the last team project. Now, we'll end up doing teamwork via Zoom. So we'll arrange that during discussion group time. So what this is about is just setting up that assignment. And this is going to be presented via Zoom to other folks in your discussion group. All right, but let's get to work now on setting up this, one of the last remaining 4 elements. So to continue to help track things, we'll continue with History Journal 21.0 here. And the first item that we want to look at now is ethnic identity. Now, ethnic identity, as you can see from this screen, is one of numerous different types of collective, communal, or social identities. So whereas many of these other alternatives could have been chosen, we're going to go with ethnic identity for, several main reasons. But as we drill down on ethnic identity, we want to make a distinction between racial identity and ethnic identity. And I think this chart does a pretty good job. The only thing that I tried to kind of make a note on was in the ethnicity column there at the bottom. In the original, it says the member of one ethnicity can join another ethnicity. Well, I think you can argue for ethnic identity, that's going to be easier than racial identity. As you can see in the box just to the left of that, generally with racial identity, that line is far more firm. One member of one race cannot join another race. But in ethnic identity, I think it's a bit more fluid. That line is a bit more permeable. But it does depend based on the ethnic group. Some ethnic groups are far more open to having new people join in, whereas other ethnic groups are still not necessarily that accepting, if you will, of outsiders. But I think this table does a pretty good job of laying out the contrast between racial and ethnic identity. Whereas racial identity, back to the top, is biological, ethnic identity is considered to be mostly more cultural. And that's what we're going to be taking a closer look at, these aspects of cultural identity. Now, when we speak of ethnic identity, and since it's in the realm of culture, as we can see from these working definitions, one of the main elements is that it involves a subjective sense of belonging. Now, earlier we spoke about subjective within the sense of the four truths of history. And if you recall at that time, subjective, the root word there is the subject. You decide. So in this sense of belonging, we're going to have a chance to explore an ethnic identity. There's a far more subjective element because not all people in the same ethnic group necessarily identify with it the same way. So we're going to explore that, but keeping in mind our context, what we're going to be doing for our upcoming project for the team presentation in creating an ethnic streetscape. Here in the United States, ethnicity is based on countries from which their ancestors came. So I wanted to make a note of that and how it related to that previous slide that we saw with that definition, because depending upon the country, as we can see here in the case of the United States, generally, not in all instances, but generally ethnicity is a bit more rigid. And you can't just make up your ancestors because that's the line through which ethnic identity is transmitted. Again, that's not necessarily the same in every case, but a good many here in the United States. In different countries, we would see different situations. But we're going to be situating our project for ethnic identity here in the United States. So to provide some context for this, I wanted to draw upon this quote from William Saroyan. A man's ethnic identity has more to do with a personal awareness than with geography. And what we're focusing on is this element of personal awareness. That dovetails with that earlier slide, the subjective element. So it's not necessarily your geography, where you are born, because in particular, here in the United States, we have immigrant groups from literally all over the world. So that ethnicity does not end once our immigrant ancestor leaves the homeland. That ethnic identity has been and continues to be transplanted here in the United States. But once it's transplanted, then it becomes more of a subjective choice and how much or how little each person might choose to be connected with that ethnic identity. Now, I believe that one great source for this is the late Marcus Lee Hansen, who did quite a bit of work with ethnic identity in American history. And what he identifies for us is the importance of that whole element of awareness, where ethnic identity is oftentimes a chosen identity in the sense of generations. So there we can see in his quote, what the son wishes to forget, the grandson wishes to remember. This is a characteristic that he found of immigrant groups that came here to the United States. Many early ethnic immigrant groups came here largely out of necessity. They were just trying to make a living. They were just trying to get by. They were just trying to live. So in the case of that immigrant generation, and different people count it differently. Some will refer to them as the first generation. Others will refer to them as the immigrant generation. But these, metaphorically speaking, these are the folks who got off the boat from wherever that homeland was and came here to the United States. Many of those folks, therefore, they did not place a high awareness necessarily on their ethnic identity because life's basic needs surpassed those. It was essential that they find food, clothing, shelter. If you were lucky enough to have all those elements covered, then you had the luxury of now potentially becoming more involved in your ethnic identity. That's the luxury of the grandson that Marcus Lee Hansen refers to here. So, and oftentimes a common characteristic the children of the immigrant generation, they wanted to be considered Americans. So you begin to see in many immigrant groups, the first generation that's born here in the United States and attempts to maybe distance themselves somewhat from their ethnic heritage. But, but then their children, hence the grandson of the immigrant generation, their children, they want to reach back to the previous generation to have a part of that heritage. So Hansen is also a key part, and we're going to be using this insight to develop this ethnic streetscape as we go forward. Now, for our purposes, what we're going to be exploring dovetails with what we've already developed in the course previously when we spoke about the notion of thick versus thin chosen identity. For this, if you recall, we had you do a history journal. How much or how little importance do you place on this particular identity marker? We as human beings have this element of choice. How thick or thin we want to identify with our ethnic heritage. I think maybe some of you have heard the reference, what are you? And someone might respond, well, I'm a Heinz 57, which is a shorthand for I'm a little bit of everything. So with having a little bit of everything, there's not much of a thick identity with a particular ethnic heritage there. Versus someone else who might be, say, half Irish and half Italian. But maybe in their case, their thicker identity might be with the Irish. Apologies to the Italians. But this is the choice that many of us can make in how much or how thick or how thin we want to adhere to our given ethnic heritage. Now, I didn't want to create a false dichotomy between just thick and thin. It's actually much more of a continuum or a spectrum, if you will. So as one way to illustrate that, there's been a lot of research that has been done in terms of ethnic identity. Here specifically, we can see in this table what was developed by Jean Finney, where she developed this model of 3 stages. The only thing I did was to tweak it here on the slide. In stage 1, that's a small or very thin connection to one's ethnic identity. But by the time you get to stage 3, that's the large or the thickest. So again, though I've been using thin and thick, I didn't want to create just that false dichotomy that it was either thick or thin. It's, I think, more accurately described as being on a continuum. So this 3-stage element is going to be something that we can make use of as we go forward developing this project. Before moving on, I just wanted to provide a couple of examples. Following the R formula, A is for assertion, R is for the reasoning, and E is for the example or the evidence. These are 2 examples in front of us now of thick or large ethnic identity. On the top left, what you see there are pictures of folks who have now, I think they're well past what Finney would say, the medium to the large connection with ethnic identity. They're going to the streets here in this demonstration, and as you can see with a large banner, a good many people in the region of Catalonia in Spain, they're advocating here for complete independence from the nation state of Spain. Today, Catalonia, one of the historic regions of Spain, has been a part of the Spanish nation state from its inception several centuries ago. But now, in the last several years, there's been a ratcheting up. That is to say, a good many more people of Catalonia are choosing their ethnic identity to be thicker versus thinner. And that same element we can see in the second image here on the bottom right. And that's with the example of thick identity when it comes to the Kurds of modern-day Iraq. All right, so let's make our transition to our next element, identity markers. But again, now that we're going with narrated PowerPoints, if I said something too quick, if you want to take some notes, Well, the beauty is now it's on video. You can just click pause or fast forward or go backwards. So for 21.1, let's now set up identity markers. The context for this will be for the Ethnic Streetscape team presentation. We're going to be asking you to develop with your teammates. So what we're going to be asking you to do is to identify identity markers and bring those to life. Now, this is consistent with this slide. You might recognize this. I've used it now several times. We have a dual dimension when it comes to identity. Though the shared root comes from idem, meaning the same, there's the personal as well as the collective sense of identity. Now, earlier in the course, we had you drill down at a few points on individual identity variables. So here's one such example, and if you recall, we had you to create something similar to this. Then we had you resort it of these identity variables. Which did you consider to be given versus chosen? Then we added another layer where we asked you from the given and the chosen, which ones do you consider to be thicker, thinner, etc. So we're going to follow what we did earlier with the identity variables for individuals, but now we're going to apply that to the collective, the group. So instead of trying to identify elements specific to just individuals, we're going to try to find identity markers that help us, if you will, with an analytical framework. There's that key word, the analytical framework to identify collective or group identity. Now, one helpful analytical framework that I've come across, you can see on the screen here, is referred to as the cultural iceberg. And once again, most of the iceberg we don't see because it's below the surface. So that's a common characteristic with identity markers, be it for the individual or the collective or the group. So some are very easy to perceive, what we can refer to as surface or visible identity markers. The graphic, you can see there the white section. What most everyone can quickly see are the festivals, the different foods that are offered, the language. Most everyone can quickly pick up on the surface or visible identity markers. But we want to challenge you as you develop this ethnic streetscape to not just focus on the visible, but also the invisible or deep identity markers. And there you can see some of those examples in terms of communication style. Again, not all facial expressions or gestures are universal. Different ethnic groups have different ways of communicating. And the same in terms of notions of courtesy. It's very characteristic for us until lately. We started the course, if you remember, always with a handshake. Now, well, we've pretty much had to put the handshake aside. So it's these more deep or invisible elements that we also want to introduce as we develop these identity markers. Here's a similar graphic, and both of these graphics, incidentally, you'll find posted on the directions page for the ethnic streetscape. So if you go to Blackboard and then you scroll down there towards the bottom, and then you'll see the day where this is due. You'll also find during discussion group, we've carved out time where we're going to be giving you as teams an opportunity to huddle together to develop. So here you have another graphic, and here the collective identity markers are somewhat similar. But in this graphic, they developed along, as you can see, artifacts, spaces, stories, experiences, language, and influencers. The reason we're introducing these analytical frameworks, either the iceberg analogy or this about values and meaning, is to help you as a team develop now a very productive and engaging ethnic streetscape. All right, so let's continue to develop the context for what we have going forward with 21.2. Let's look now at historical defining moments of identity. Now, what we're going to be looking at here, once again, we can begin to understand on the individual level. Well, I think many of us are aware there's been success in cloning mammals. So, for example, it wasn't so long ago, I recall that there was the first successful cloning of a sheep. Her name was Dolly. That was the name that was given to the successful cloning of a sheep. Since then, this, of course, is now accelerating. And many people believe it's not going to be a question of if, but when. When will humans be successfully cloned? Some people believe this is already underway. Some people believe that there's already been some human clones, but because it wasn't successful, that's why the news wasn't released. But suffice to say, we can presume there's quite a few folks who are interested in potentially developing human clones. All right, setting that aside for the moment, let's just go with a hypothetical. If humans could be cloned, if you were cloned, would your clone be like you? Now, this is not meant as a trick question, because the answer is yes, or the answer is no. Yes, the clone would be like you in terms of genetics, but your clone, your potential clone, would not be you, however, because of memory. Stephen King, the noted author, proclaimed this, stating, "A person's memory is everything, really. Memory is identity. It's you. Your potential clone would be you genetically, but your clone would not have the same experiences. They would not have the same memories that you have. So, in that sense, your clone would not be identical to you." Now, the importance of memory can be a good thing or a bad thing. Let's talk about let's start good news or bad news first. Let's do the bad news. The bad news is, I think we're all familiar with folks who, because of some trauma in their life, are still reliving that in terms of their memory. That's how, this is the worst side sometimes of our memories, that we can't seem to set aside many of these traumatic, bad experiences. All right, so that's the bad news when it comes to memory. But then, of course, there's the good news. The good news in the precious memories that many of us have. Granted, some of these might be painful, but we also have many joyful memories that help make us who we are. But let's shift it now to the collective. Moving now from individual memories and how they make us who we are individually, let's transition to collective memories, more specifically, historical moments. People who were aware on December 7, 1941, here in the United States, knew exactly where they were when they heard the news that the Japanese had launched a surprise attack on the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. That became a unifying, hence idem, the same shared historical memory for that generation of 1941. Then we can push it up another generation and the same thing. The day that President Kennedy was assassinated is a day that every person who was aware on that November day of 1963, they are very self-aware where they were the moment they heard the news. So this is an example of that collective historical moment that defines a specific generation. And it continues. I was only 1 year old when President Kennedy was assassinated. So that didn't resonate for me. Not until 1986 did I participate for the first time in a shared collective national memory. And that was with the explosion of the shuttle Challenger. On that day, as you can see, unfortunately, in this graphic, the shuttle as it was flying up after takeoff in Florida exploded, and everyone on board perished. And again, every person knows where they were the day they heard this news. A little closer to your own time, you can speak to people just a little older than you, and they'll tell you where they were on September 11, 2001, when they heard the news of the attacks in Washington as well as New York, and when the plane crashed in Pennsylvania. The reason we went for those historical moments was to provide further context, again, on some invisible elements of a generation. They're not necessarily what people from the outside can see because we can't see memories. So that's an example of the deep, invisible elements of identity that we want you to consider as you develop this ethnic streetscape. Now, here with 21.3, what I want to take some time to do is essentially to follow like a math class. Generally in math, the instructor tries to provide you a case study, a sample problem. And the hope is, after doing a sample problem or a few of them, then you're better prepared to now begin to start solving these issues, these problems on your own. So I'm going to be using now, the Basques has a case study for identity markers. Again, I'll use now Basques to illustrate some of these elements provided for you on the instructions page there on Blackboard for the Ethnic Streetscape team presentation. Okay. So let's see if I can't now add some context to some of these elements. Now, real quick, just so we have clarity on expectations, your team is not expected to have to address each and every one of these elements. Pick some. Pick some that put you within the time constraints. There you go. So again, the expectation is not that you address all of these for your assigned ethnic group. We're just going to try to give you now, using Basques as a case study, some examples of how you could go about doing this. Now, for our case study, all right, as we're looking at this image, what's going on here? Well, if you go to Google Images and just type in Basques, you're going to get a screen like this. Now, previously, just a few years ago, if you typed in Basques, you would get the ones without the white boxes. I'm not exactly sure when this really kind of caught on, but just a few years ago, the alternate version of Basques began to pop up. Basque is also a word for woman's lingerie. So there you have it. So when you type in Google Images, Basques, you're going to start getting this kind of mismatch of images. So again, for clarity, we're going to be talking about the ones without the white boxes. Those are the Basques that we're talking about. There we go. Let's move on. So what I'm going to try to do is use Basques as an example of what we're going to ask each of your teams to develop. So again, this is all on the instructions page, but there you see in front of you by your team number, which ethnic American immigrant group that you're being assigned. Provided you is a PDF, and these PDFs are like 3-4 pages. With the permission of the author, my colleague in the history department, Todd Shallett. Some years ago, he had his book published, Ethnic Landmarks, 10 Historic Places That Define the City of Trees, Boise, Idaho. So I figured what we could now do is follow what Leah Singer was speaking about, because I think there's a good portion of truth here. Why travel the globe, but not make an effort to get to know your neighbor? The neighbor that we're going to try to get to know is our neighbor, well, your neighbor here in Boise. But we're going to do that using some historical perspectives. What we have here are 5 early ethnic immigrant groups here to the United States. One of the chapters is on the Basques. So I'll be using that as our case study. But then what we're going to ask is now, Team 1, We're going to ask you to develop an ethnic streetscape for Irish Americans. Team 2, you'll do the same for Mexican Americans. 3, German Americans. 4, develop for early Jewish Americans. And Team 5 for Chinese Americans. So what we need to look for each of our assigned ethnic identity groups are these identity markers, be they on the surface, visible, or deep, invisible. Now let's set up our Basque case study. Assume as you develop this that not everyone that you'll be presenting to in the discussion group knows exactly the geography of the group that you're talking about. Okay, so be it the Chinese, pop up a map of where China is. Let's just go ahead and make that available. Where do Jewish Americans immigrate from? All right, so you can go back, and for that you can start with the New Testament. They're in the Holy Land, then update it as Jews moved out, etc. All right, so don't assume that people automatically know the geography. So in the case of the Basques, I wouldn't assume that most of you know where the Basque homeland is. If you can see here in this graphic, it's there in a part of what is today Spain and France. Here, doing kind of a poor man's version of Google Earth and zooming in closer. It's a very small area there in what is northern Spain and southern France. It's not more than 100 miles in any direction. So it's essentially the distance from Boise to Twin Falls. So it's a very small place in the world, but that's where Basques originate from. Now, did the Basques start there? Most certainly not. We're not exactly sure. The prevailing theory is that human life originated in what is today Africa. All right, so when we pick up the story of the Basques, however, this is where we first encounter them, in their homeland of Western Europe. Now, until just a few years ago, if you would have heard anything about the Basques, it probably would have been this. Until a few years ago, in the Basque Country, there was a small minority that was agitating for complete independence from Spain. And this small minority was ready and willing to use violence to achieve this. Here you see an image, and this group took the acronym ETA, which in the Basque language loosely translates for independence for the Basque Country. And because they're terrorists, they're illegal, they're criminals, that's why they have the masks on. All right, but until just a few years ago, this might have been the dominant narrative. We're happy now to report this is no longer a dominant characteristic of Basque identity. Ironically, in the previous slide that I showed you, now it's the people of Catalan, of that part of Spain, that in some ways are more actively agitating for independence than the Basques are. But that's the setup of what we'll have a chance to explore a bit more in detail. Today, meanwhile, I think if you hear about the Basques in general, you're almost certainly to hear about the famous running of the bulls during the feast of San Fermin in one of the largest Basque cities, Pamplona. And if you haven't had a chance, just go to YouTube. You can just type in the running of the bulls, and there you can see it from oftentimes start to finish. As you can see, literally thousands of people there in the bottom left graphic come together for over a week of festivals. But being Basque isn't just for Basques anymore, especially since we're using the Basques as our case study here in Boise, Idaho. Before, the Idaho Historical Museum was closed, then renovated, and just recently reopened, only to be closed again now because of the coronavirus. There on the top left, their last major exhibit before they closed for renovation was Essential Idaho, 150 things that make the gem state unique. So there, the letter D in that graphic, that's the Basque flag. And there you have a Basque dancer. On the bottom right is a mural here from downtown Boise. And there too, the letter B is done with the colors of the Basque flag. So, Basque identity, referencing that earlier slide, until recently, I think you could have argued that in almost every case, you could not become Basque if you were not born Basque. It had to be a given identity. But now, there are, I think, in many areas of the Basque world, an openness to accepting people, those who wish to participate to become a larger part of, if you will, Basque identity. So in some places of the Basque world, we're taking Basque converts. And I would venture that's certainly the case here at the Basque Block in Boise that we'll be seeing here in a moment. But before we go to the Basque Block, we can quickly put in a plug. Here at Boise State University, you have an opportunity, a very rare opportunity, to learn more about one of, what's considered to be the mystery people of Europe. There are various courses that are offered, language classes to learn the Basque language, and there are full 3-credit courses as well as weekend workshops. So if you find yourself becoming a bit more interested in the Basques, do keep in mind there's lots more that you can find out, and take a look at the Boise State website for Basque Studies. All right, that was our infomercial. Now back to our setup. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that when we pick up the Basques in history, history in a very narrow sense is the first time that the Basques are showing up in the historical record. That's about 2,000 years ago, when the ancient Romans now moved into this part of Western Europe. Now, the language of the Romans was Latin, and they encountered people who were already living there. The predecessors of today's Basques. The Romans assigned or gave these groups different names. We're not sure how close or how far the Latin names were to what the actual locals used. All right, but as you can see from this graphic, one of the names that the early Romans who wrote about the Basques 2,000 years ago, one of the names they used for them was Vascones, as you can see there. Then, centuries later, Vascones morphed when the Spanish language developed to become Vasco. Meanwhile, since the Basque Country straddles the Spanish as well as the French side, okay, the Basque version in French also derived from Vascones. And because a good many of our inheritance from Latin came via French, we've adopted, if you will, the French version of the spelling. So when we speak in English about the Basques, we almost always use the spelling B-A-S-Q-U-E. But that is not the name that Basques use for themselves, right? So you'll oftentimes find this. When an outsider comes upon a group they've never encountered, they give them a name that's not necessarily the same name that the locals used. Such is the case here with the Basques. The Basque name for themselves is Euskaldunak. And what that literally means is those who have or speak the Basque language. Now in English, we just conflate both of them. We use the word Basque for the people, and we use the word Basque for the language. Well, something similar happens here. Euskaldunak derives from those who speak the Basque language. So historically, we believe one of the primary identity markers for the Basque people was something that was invisible until you finally heard it, the language. Just a brief word now about the language, because language plays different roles in the different identity groups that you've been assigned. But in the case of the Basques, it's probably the most unique thing about Basque ethnic identity. Most everything else about Basque culture, we can almost always find that has been borrowed or adapted from neighbors elsewhere, except for their language. The most unique element of the Basque people is their language, Euskara. It is unique in that it is unrelated to any other language in the world. Okay, so English is related to other Germanic languages. So our language, our modern English language, actually, if we go back in time into history, derived from earlier Germanic languages. The Romance languages, all derived from a common root of Latin. So from Latin of the Romans, then we had what would develop to become what we today know as Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and then the bonus, Romanian. The Basque language, therefore, is unrelated to any other language around them. Everyone else there in that part of Western Europe speaks some derived version of Latin, okay, except the Basques. This intrigued Mark Kurlansky. Mark Kurlansky is the author of the biggest selling English language book about the Basques. His book, The Basque History of the World, sold the greatest number, as I noted. And ironically, it was written by a man who is not Basque himself. Mark Kurlansky is Jewish. And it might be one of the reasons that he developed such an interest in Basques. See, as Kurlansky notes, and many people know, most small groups like the Basques, small groups like the Jews, well, the norm is they're assimilated by their neighbors. See, with very few exceptions, that's how most all groups have gone. But the Basques are one of those very few exceptions. Everyone else in what is today Spain and France, for example, speak some version of a language derived from Latin. The Basques, meanwhile, have maintained their unique language. And Kurlansky believes that's one of the main reasons the Basques are still here. The thick identity of language allowed for Basques to endure across these millennia. And that Basque endurance plays out throughout Basque America. This graphic takes us to Elko, Nevada. There, during the 4th of July weekend, every year, the area Basques host their annual weekend Basque National Basque Festival. And it's an illustration of moving from medium, if not to large. Here now, these folks are very proud of their heritage. And every 4th of July, they go through the streets. Now, tellingly, you'll see in the graphic, you have the Basque flag there, the red, white, and green. But what opens the parade is the red, white, and blue of the American flag. See, purposely, the Basques of Elko wanted to do this on the 4th of July weekend to demonstrate to their non-Basque neighbors that yes, they are Basque, but that they also identified as being Americans. The U.S. Census, the best guesstimate that we have, tells us that there are Basques in all 50 states. The majority of Basques, however, live here in the western states. The largest population of Basques are in California. We have the latest guesstimate of about 20-some thousand in California. Number 2 is then Idaho. There are guesstimates of about maybe 9,000 people who self-identified of being of Basque descent. Number 3 is Nevada. But here you can see the distribution of Basques throughout the western part of the United States. But now the story that we want to tell, and this is what we're asking you to tell for your immigrant group. So keep this in mind. I'm not going to be telling you too much of the story about the Basques who stayed in the Basque Country. We want you to tell the story not just of the Jews who stayed in the Eastern Hemisphere, but the Jews who came here to the United States to make America their new home. We're not going to be asking you to tell the story of the Chinese who stayed home. We want you to tell the story of those Chinese who chose to come to make America their home. So why do Basques choose to come here to the United States? There's various reasons, but one is right there in the graphic on this slide. That's a graphic of the gold rush of 1849. Outside of Sacramento in California, news quickly got out to the rest of the world that gold had been discovered. And it triggered one of the most massive influxes of a population in a short amount of time, as everyone seemed to have contracted gold fever. It was from that initial gold rush that Basques then began to make their way into what is today Idaho. We know that Basques have been in Idaho since the 1890s. So pay attention to those PDF chapters for each of your groups, because there, in most instances, Dr. Todd Shallett gives you the starting point when this ethnic group began to make Idaho its home. Well, that applies to Basques in the 1890s. Here you've got our Basque immigrants. They've ditched the Basque beret, so they're going for the hat style of the time. They got the cigars, and they have, of course, their Levi 501s. Customized, of course, because you had to fold them up at the bottom. See, in the classic 501s, you always bought them bigger because when you washed them a few times, they would shrink. But this is how you could tell people that you had a new pair of pants on. See, because they hadn't been washed yet, and you had them folded up. So there's some early Basque immigrants. Another early Basque immigrant, and now we have on the graphic on the right side. That's my great aunt, and she's standing below a sign that was painted on a building. That's my grandfather's name, Benito Isursa. He was the proprietor of a Basque boarding house here in Boise, Idaho. And my grandfather's case, he came to make America his home in 1915. Now, there's various reasons that Basques end up in different parts of the world and why Basques end up in the American West. The main reason, though, I think, is the sheep thing. And what I reference by the sheep thing and what it is that explains why Basques disproportionately are here in the American West. Most of our early Basque immigrants, they did not speak English. They spoke a little Spanish, they might have spoken some French, and they spoke Basque. So when they came here, they had very limited economic opportunities. One of the few things that was available to them was to work as sheep herders. And disproportionately, many early Basque immigrants of the late 1800s and first part of the 20th century came here as sheep herders. That's why I referenced, therefore, the sheep thing. Here you see the graphic of an Idaho license plate. This is no longer available. It was one of the vanity plate options that was available for purchase some years ago. But when it was decided to push out a Basque-themed license plate, of course, the most obvious symbol they could use was a sheep wagon. You can see there with the green and the white. The image on the right, that takes us to Reno, Nevada, and there you have the National Monument to the Basque sheepherder. So the sheep thing was a phenomena that explains why Basques predominated here in the American West, because until very recently, this was open rangeland, and it lent itself quite nicely to herding and raising sheep. But by the 1970s, the sheep industry had gone into decline here in the United States. There are various reasons for this. Over time, economies change. But one example, in World War II, I think many of us have seen those war movies. All the uniforms of the U.S. military, they were made of wool. Okay, and that, of course, comes from sheep. So there was a huge demand for sheep because wool was one of the main means of creating clothing. But soon after World War II, we had the huge shift to what are now considered synthetic materials. So like rayon, these type of polyester type material that created less of a demand for wool, and that's what contributed to the decline of the sheep industry. So for Basque identity to endure, it had to shift its space. So here you see a graphic from Google Earth to the downtown Basque block. And this is what we're going to be asking you to reimagine for your ethnic identity group. So I'm going to walk you through how the Basques have essentially set up what we call the Basque block, and then we're going to ask you for your team project to pretend. To pretend that the Basques move out and your identity group now purchases this downtown city block. And your team has been tasked with recreating this block to be fill in the blank. Whatever your team number was, whether it's the Irish block, the Chinese block, Jewish block, etc. So again, we'll use the Basques as a case study, as an example of what we're asking you as a team now to reimagine this block downtown. So let's do a little before and after. This is what this part of Grove Street looked like before the year 2000. It was in the year 2000 that the Basque block, as we see it today, was created. So this is what it looked like. It's still the same one way. Okay. But this is how you'll see it today. Okay. It's been transformed. There's a new streetscape. Many of the original buildings are still intact. All right, but now they've been renovated, as you can see. There in this graphic, the red brick building, that's one of Boise's oldest brick buildings. And it was built as a Basque boarding house. The windows there across the front, those were the individual rooms for the boarders. But there's a big reveal or surprise or a hidden element of ethnic identity if you go inside. Because what's inside this building is a full-size Basque handball court. So if you play racquetball, imagine a racquetball court about 6 times larger. And that's what you have there in that building. So again, that's an example of hidden, or if you will, deep identity markers. Here's the Boise Bass Center. This was constructed in 1949. That's what it looked like early on. And this is how you'll see it today. It was the exterior was renovated back in the 1970s to make it more characteristic of Basque architecture, which uses a lot of the white stucco, wooden beams, and the red tile roof. And there again, you'll see the American as well as the Basque flag. If you go to the Basque block today, you'll see the renovated oldest brick house of Boise, Idaho. This is what it looked like before the year 2000, and this is what you'll be able to see today. So the Basque block has not always existed. 2000, so we're just coming up on its 20th anniversary. So you're not too far behind in your own project. All right, so this is not something that reaches back generation upon generation. So here, hopefully, you and your team, you can quickly catch up, researching your American ethnic identity group and bring about this transformation for this downtown block. All right, so I want to point out some of the buildings that we're asking you to reimagine. All right, so on the Basque block, you have the restaurant that's called Leku Ona, which literally in Basque means the good place. All right, so remember, with this scenario, Basques have vacated the Basque block. So this building is empty. This is now your restaurant. So Jewish, Chinese, Irish, what do you serve on the menu? What kind of entertainment might you have on the patio in the summer, etc. So we're asking you to reimagine what would you serve there at this restaurant. How would you decorate now your version of this streetscape? The Basque examples we see here on the left is the Ikurriña. That's the Basque word for the Basque flag, okay? The red, white, and green. So on the Basque block, if just even in this image, if you keep looking, you'll see just a few light poles that continue. The Basque flag continues with that theme. There you'll see wrap that was placed also on the utility box. That leads us to the next image, the Lauburu. Lauburu in Basque literally means the 4 heads. This is an ancient traditional Basque symbol, and you'll see that there often on the Basque block. So these are examples of what we're asking you to find for your ethnic identity group as you would go about now redesigning and redecorating this downtown city block. In the case of the Basques, here you see a placard that was placed on a wall. These are aspens, a type of tree, and as you can see, they have been carved on. One of the things that Basque sheepherders did, and you can pause the video if you want to read a little further, but one of the things that Basque sheepherders did to stave off the boredom is they would carve things into these aspen trees. So part of telling the Basque story, which connects with what I said was the sheep thing, here you have, if you will, this mural. So we're asking you to imagine in some places there on the block, what might you place on walls that would serve to inform folks to learn something about this group? And again, the image on the right, there we have a wrap around a utility box. One of the key defining elements of Basques is ethnic folk dance. It's one of the key elements that's maintained Basque identity here in the Boise area, and that's what you see illustrated here. So what we're asking you to consider is how do they keep young people identifying with ethnic heritage in your assigned identity group? In the case of the Basques, Basque dance has always been a key way of maintaining a sense of Basque ethnic identity. On the Basque block, you've got a museum. So we're asking you now to reimagine this space. What would be a main exhibit or two that you would include? So because of what I've already told you, you can imagine, if you haven't been into the Basque Museum, there's going to be something about sheep when you go in there. Now, it's not the only thing, but if you're going to tell the story about Basques in the American West, you have to have an exhibit about the role that the sheep industry has played. All right, so if this is going to be an Irish museum, well, you're probably going to have something about the potato famine. If you weren't aware of the potato famine in Irish history, there was an enormous blight that decimated most all of the Irish potato crop. And that's what triggered a massive exodus of Irish to come here to the United States in the 1800s. So that relates back, if you will, to that historical moment. A defining element of Irish American identity, that shared historical moment, was the potato famine of the 19th century. So consider what you would include as a main exhibit or two in your new museum. What street art would you include? On the Basque block, you have Basque surnames. This is just one of several carved granite. These are various Basque surnames of families here in the Treasure Valley. On the right, here you have the lyrics of the de facto Basque national anthem. There is no Basque nation state. There's a Basque nation, but not a nation state. So I told you about the Basque flag. You will never see that Basque flag at the United Nations in New York because the Basques don't have a nation state. See, they either belong to the nation state of Spain or the nation state of France. That's what their passports are. But there is a sense of Basque identity. There is a sense of a Basque nation. And Guernica-ko Arbola is the de facto, not the formal or official, but essentially the de facto Basque national anthem. And there you have it translated, the first verse. Basques all over the world are familiar with this song. Other invisible elements on the Basque block that wouldn't be necessarily readily apparent. On the Capitol Boulevard sign, there are a pair of what are called itai, as you can see here. It's the lowercase h. These are traditional farm implements. They were used to prepare the soil to plant seeds. And what's invisible is effectively what this itai represents. If a culture, and in this case, an ethnic culture, cannot figure out how to transmit its ethnic identity to the next generation and the generation after that, that ethnic group goes away. So you have to find an effective means of transmitting. So metaphorically, how is that symbolized here invisibly with the itai? Every generation has to prepare the soil to hopefully now get future generations to continue to move this forward. Then the graphic on the right, I just mentioned the de facto Basque national anthem, the Guernica-ko Arbola. That literally in English means the tree of Guernica. This is a seedling of the original tree of Guernica in the Basque Country. The tree of Guernica, what makes it invisible is that this is the equivalent of the Statue of Liberty for most Americans. What the Statue of Liberty represents to most Americans, liberty, is what the tree of Guernica represents to Basques. So that's what we're asking you to explore for your assigned ethnic identity group. Some of these invisible, below the surface elements. Now, on the capital side of the Basque block, you have this restored historical mural. So we're asking you to envision, to tell the story of your ethnic group in a few images. In this example, starting on the left, you see that ship there on the sea. That's one of the original ships of Christopher Columbus's three. Many of his sailors in 1492 were Basque. So the story starts there in 1492. Then you have an image of the Basque country right below it. The traditional Basque farmhouses with the white stucco, the red tile roof that I referenced earlier. That's why they remodeled the Basque Center so it would more closely match the historical traditional way of designing homes in the Basque Country. We've spoken about the tree of Guernica. All right, so there you have the image of the tree in the town of Guernica in the Basque Country. And just to the left of that is an excerpt of one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century, Pablo Picasso's Guernica. And during the Spanish Civil War, the 1930s, the Basque town of Guernica was bombed by Hitler's Air Force. Hitler lent his Air Force because he wanted to test if aerial bombardment would work for him. Unfortunately, we know how that story went. In the short term, he found success in this attempt in Guernica, and that would give him confidence to launch World War II. But there you have the tree of Guernica, which for Basques is a symbol for liberty. Then you have the key role played by Basque folk dance. Now, what's hazy there in the background is her name is Jay Ormachea. She responded to a challenge to teach young people how to dance. And she was key in developing dance classes for young Basque children. And that's why still today, if you go to the Basque Block and you have an opportunity to go to a festival there, the dancing continues because of people like Jay Ormachea and people like Jim Gisaro. Jim Gisaro is the man playing the accordion there on the mural. Okay. So this recognizes two icons. So again, are there some significant individuals? This goes to those analytical frameworks that we showed you there in the directions. One of them refers to as the influencers that might help to tell the story of your group. The dancers are superimposed on the Cathedral of St. John the Evangelist. Most all Basque immigrants are Catholic Christians. And this is the Catholic cathedral here in Boise. Then as we complete this mural, we have the late Jose Luis Arrieta, and he's lifting a cubic rock. This weighs several hundred pounds, and it's an example of a traditional Basque sport. Most traditional Basque sports evolved from work. So baseball doesn't derive from work. Basketball doesn't derive from work. So most of our modern sports don't have their origins from a form of work. They were developed purely for recreation. But traditional Basque sports, they took the work they were doing on those farmhouses. So in the farmhouse, before you had forklifts and all those kind of inventions, you pretty much had to lift everything on your own. So that form of work was converted now into a sporting event. And that's what's illustrated there with the lifting of that cubic block. And then, of course, last but not least, there's the sheep thing. There you see the sheep and the sheep wagon in the distance. So there is what we're asking you to develop as a team. Could you come up with several images that would tell the story of your immigrant group here in the Treasure Valley? So be realistic. as you look at this block from downtown Boise. All right, so don't toss out something that would cost $50 million to accomplish. So if you're doing the Chinese block, okay, we're going to recreate a portion of the wall of China. Okay, maybe settle for a smaller portion. Okay, so be realistic in what you're trying to envision as a team for the redesign of this downtown block here in Boise, Idaho. Now, as we bring this to a close, unfortunately, like most things here in town, the Bass Block is pretty much shut down today. But hopefully, once this coronavirus situation improves, you're more than welcome to make your way there to see it for yourself if you haven't had a chance to do so already. And I wanted to extend to you now a personal invitation. You don't have to be Bass to go to Bass parties. What made the Running of the Bulls worldwide famous was Ernest Hemingway, the author who wrote about this. And now it's one of the biggest celebrations that's known worldwide. Well, the same applies on a smaller scale here in the Treasure Valley. Always the last weekend of July is the celebration of the feast of St. Ignatius of Loyola, who is the patron saint of Idaho Basques. So this summer, if we get past the coronavirus, that regular festival will morph into what is called Hayaldi 2020. And it's the largest Basque celebration outside of the Basque Country. So if you're around here towards the end of July, you'll definitely want to tap into this. Tree Fort is big. This is huge. It brings people from all corners, and it's a great celebration. And again, you don't have to be Basque to be considered invited to this. So again, do take a look at the instructions there on our Blackboard homepage. If something is not clear, please get in touch with me to get some clarification what it is that we're asking you as a team to develop. This is a chance for you now to be creative, to reimagine how this early ethnic group that made Boise its home, how that ethnic group's identity can be manifested on this downtown city block. All right, so next time, well, you can anticipate the next video I'll be pushing out of the narrated PowerPoint. We're going to be drilling down more for the second of our 4 remaining elements. We have one more exam. Now, of course, we can't take a Blue Book exam anymore, so this is going to be moved online. So I'll say more about all of that next time as we continue to tell the story of From Given to Chosen. I introduced first the role of the Renaissance and Reformation, so we'll continue with that story as we go forward. That's it for now. Thanks for checking in. Once again, if you have questions that you have, please get in touch with us. Email Emily or myself. Hope you're doing well, making the adjustments now to our new coronavirus situation. And be well and remain Bronco strong.